You know that feeling when you're scrolling through someone's perfect life online and you think, how is everything so easy for them? But what if it's not easy? What if the person who seems to have it all figured out is actually following a script written by someone else for someone else decades ago? This isn't a story about failure, it's a story about a different kind of ghost. The ghost of a parent's unlived life. Meet Alex. On paper, Alex is the prototype of success. A rising star in a prestigious law firm, driving the right car, living in the right postcode. His decisions are precise, his trajectory is linear, his life is correct. To everyone watching, Alex isn't just winning, he's executing a flawless game plan. But if you could see inside the quiet moments, the pause, before he enters a courtroom, the way he stares at his reflection in the elevator, you'd notice something. A flatness, a disconnect, as if he's watching his own life through a thick pane of glass. People call it burnout. They say he needs a vacation, a hobby, a better work-life balance. But this isn't about being tired. This is about being haunted. Alex's father was a brilliant man with a dream that never got air. A musician whose guitar collected dust in a closet replaced by a briefcase and a lifetime of responsible choices. He never complained. He just quietly transferred the blueprint of his abandoned life onto his son. So Alex learned not through lectures, but through osmosis. Through the weight of a silent, hopeful gaze. He learned that love was conditional on certain kinds of achievement, that his real passions, the messy, creative, uncertain ones, were luxuries his family's story could not afford. He didn't choose a career, he inherited a mission. His ambition isn't driven by desire. It's driven by a deep somatic loyalty, a fear that, if he stops achieving the ghost, he's been feeding the ghost of his father's potential will finally turn and ask, what was it all for? This is the psychology of the invisible inheritance. It's not about pressure. It's about possession, The nervous system doesn't know the difference between your dream and a dream you're carrying for someone else. It just knows it's running a marathon it never signed up for. The body holds the tension of a life that isn't yours. The anxiety isn't fear of failure, it's the terror of authenticity. What happens if I want something else? Who do I betray if I step off this path? So you become an excellent performer in a role you didn't write. You master the lines, the blocking, the emotional cues. The world applauds. But backstage, there's a quiet, relentless question. Whose life am I living? And here is the plot twist, the quiet bomb at the center of it all. The parent doesn't know they're doing it. This isn't a story about manipulation. It's about unconscious translation, A parent looks at their child and sees a blank page where they can finally write the correct story. They are not gaslighting you. They are with all the love in their heart, ghostwriting you, They offer the safe path, the respected career, the stable choice, not as a cage but as a gift, the gift of the life they were told they should have wanted. The love is real, the prison is real too. Alex's moment of collapse isn't a dramatic breakdown. It happens on a Tuesday. He wins a big case. His colleagues celebrate. He's handed a glass of champagne, and as he raises it, he looks around the room at the polished wood, the expensive suits, the faces of expectation, and he feels nothing. Absolutely nothing. Just the cold, smooth glass in his hand and the deafening silence of a ghost's applause. That's the moment. When the borrowed dream runs out of fuel and you're left alone in a car you never wanted on a road to a destination that was never yours. The question isn't, why am I so unhappy when I have everything? The question is, who would I be if I returned this life that was never mine to begin with? There is a kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much you've done. It's about how long you've been pretending. It's the fatigue of a performance so seamless, so convincing, that even you have forgotten where the stage ends and you begin. The applause becomes a form of loneliness. The standing ovation, a quiet echo in an empty room. This is the architecture of the borrowed life. It doesn't feel like a cage at first. It feels like love. It feels like safety. It feels like a blueprint handed to you by someone who only wants to see you built solid, secure, unshakable. You follow the lines, pour the foundation, raise the walls. You stand inside the structure, and everyone tells you how magnificent it is, how strong, how right. And for years you don't hear the hum, that low, persistent frequency in the walls, the vibration of a life running on a current that isn't yours. Maya's blueprint was drawn in the language of service. Her mother, a nurse who worked double shifts in a fading hospital, spoke of the body not as a mystery, but as a system to be mastered, a machine to be repaired. Love in their home was a practical verb. It was showing up. It was fixing things. It was silence in the face of weariness. So Maya became a surgeon. not in a burst of passion, but in a steady, determined climb. She mastered the anatomy, the procedures, the cool detachment required to hold a beating heart. In the operating room, she was a marvel of precision. Her hands were steady, her mind was clear, but in the quiet of her own apartment, her hands would tremble. A fine, almost invisible shake. She'd stare at them, these tools of her supposed destiny, and feel a disconnect so profound it was like looking at someone else's limbs. Her anxiety wasn't about the surgery, it was about the silence afterward. The hollow click of her heels in the empty parking garage. The way she could suture a wound closed but couldn't name the ache in her own chest. She was fluent in the language of pathology but mute in the language of her own desire. "What do you want, Maya?" The question would surface and her mind would go blank. Then it would offer a script. "Times I want to be better, faster, more capable. I want to save more. Asterisk. Those weren't wants. Those were refinements of the blueprint." This is the central nervous system of the inherited life. It's not pursuing a goal. It's maintaining a condition. The goal is external. The title, the approval, the perfect execution. The condition is internal, the avoidance of a terrifying question. What if I don't want the life I've been building? The body registers this conflict not as a thought but as a physics problem. You are applying force in one direction while your center of gravity pulls in another. The result isn't collapse but a constant draining tension. A life lived in perpetual resistance to its own current. You mistake this tension for dedication, for drive. You tell yourself the numbness is focus. The emptiness is professionalism. But the body keeps a different ledger. It logs the tremor in the hands, the sleep that doesn't rest, the joy that feels like a distant, theoretical concept. You are not burning out. You are experiencing a profound somatic dissonance. You're living a metaphor and your bones are tired of translating. For Maya, the plot twist didn't come in a dramatic failure. It came in a mundane, almost ridiculous success. She was assigned a rotation in a pediatric ward. A distraction, she thought, from her real work in the OR. One afternoon, a small boy post-op for a routine procedure was crying not from pain but from fear of the balloon he'd been given. It was a clown balloon, garish and smiling. "It's watching me," he whispered, terrified. The nurses were busy. The mother was flustered. Maya, the brilliant surgeon, stood there holding a chart utterly useless. "It's not possible." On an impulse she didn't understand, she took the balloon. She found a marker in her coat pocket. With a few quick lines, she turned the clown's smile into a grumpy frown, added bushy eyebrows, a tiny hat. She presented it back. "He's not watching you," she said, her voice softer than she'd heard it in years. "He's just having a very bad day. Now he's too grumpy to bother anyone." The boy stared. Then he giggled. A pure, uncomplicated sound that seemed to crack the sterile air of the room, and Maya felt it. A jolt. Not in her mind, but in her hands. The same hands that held a scalpel with perfect indifference were now buzzing with a strange electric warmth. It was the feeling of creating a moment, not just managing an outcome. It was the feeling of time's play asterisk. In that instant, the blueprint tore. She wasn't just a surgeon who'd calmed a child. She was someone who times drew asterisk, who transformed fear into a story, who used her hands not to dissect but to connect. The skill was hers, but the context, the entire architecture of meaning around it was a borrowed shell. The unconscious translation became visible. Her mother had seen a world of broken systems and given her the tools to fix them, scalpel, suture, protocol. But what if Maya's native language wasn't repair but time's re-enchantment times? What if her hands weren't meant just to close wounds, but to make things that made people feel less alone? The love was real. The gift of stability, of purpose was real. But the prison was the unexamined assumption that there was only one way to be of service, that the only valid script was written in the grammar of sacrifice. Walking back to the surgical wing, the tremor in her hands was gone, replaced by a different kind of energy, a quiet, terrifying clarity. The question was no longer, why am I so empty when I'm so successful? The question was, what have I been drawing on the walls of this life I built, waiting for someone to see? The inheritance was not the career. It was the deeper, unspoken lesson that care is a serious, solemn duty. Her rebellion would not be to stop caring, but to redefine it. To discover that care could also be light, could be play, could be a grumpy balloon and a shared laugh in a sunlit room. Healing wouldn't mean abandoning the structure. It would mean finally moving into it as herself, bringing her own furniture, painting the walls, a colour not on the blueprint, learning that the most profound service she could offer might begin not with knowing all the answers, but with being willing to pick up a marker and draw a new face on an old fear. The borrowed life ends when you realize you are not a tenant, you are the architect. And the most radical act is not to destroy the building, but to finally admit you've been living in the wrong rooms, to walk across the hall, to open a door you didn't know you had the key for, and to step into a space that for the first time echoes with the sound of your own breath, your own pulse, your own untranslated desire. It is the moment you stop performing a masterpiece and start sketching your own rough, beautiful, imperfect draft. There is a kind of silence that doesn't come from emptiness. It comes from a choice made so deeply and so often that it becomes a reflex. The choice to translate yourself into a language the world can easily process, even when it means leaving the most vital parts of you untranslated. For Maya, the translation was flawless. She spoke the crisp, clean dialect of competence, of protocols followed, problems solved, systems restored to optimal function. It was a language of repair, and she was fluent. But fluency in a second language often comes at the cost of your native tongue. And her native tongue wasn't repair. It was time's re-enchantment asterisk. It was the vocabulary of seeing not what was broken, but what was waiting to be imagined. It was the grammar of connection, not just correction. Her hands trained to suture and seal held a deeper memory, a memory of making, of creating things not to fix a problem, but to answer a quieter, more haunting question times. How do we make each other feel less alone asterisk? The love was real. The gift of stability, of purpose, of a clear script in a confusing world, it was all profoundly real. Her father had given her a map, and she had followed it to a place of respect, of usefulness, of undeniable skill. But the prison was the unexamined footnote on that map. The assumption written in invisible ink that there was only one valid destination, that service only counted if it looked like sacrifice. That care was a solemn, serious duty, and duty had no room for play, for whimsy, for the kind of care that arrived not with a solution but with a shared breath of recognition. Her emptiness wasn't a failure of the script. It was the quiet, persistent sound of a native tongue, rusted from disuse, trying to form a single forbidden word, times enough asterisk. Walking back to the surgical wing, the tremor in her hands was gone, replaced by a different kind of vibration. A resonant clarity, quiet and terrifying. The question had shifted. It was no longer times. Why am I so empty when I'm so successful? Times. The new question hummed in her veins. Times. What have I been drawing on the walls of this life? I built waiting for someone to see asterisk. She realized she had been leaving clues for herself for years. In the precise, almost artistic way, she arranged instruments, a private nod to beauty in the sterile field. In the extra moment, she took to place a hand on a nervous patient's shoulder, a communication that bypassed medical jargon and went straight to the somatic, the human. These weren't just professional touches, they were fragments of her native language breaking through the translation. The inheritance was not the career, it was the deeper lesson passed down through generations of serious, responsible people that to be of value is to be of times use asterisk. Her rebellion would not be to stop caring but to expand its definition, to discover that care could also be light, could be creativity, could be a grumpy balloon animal, and the startled, genuine laugh it pulled from a tired man in 304. Healing wouldn't mean abandoning the structure. It would mean finally moving into it as herself, bringing her own furniture, painting the walls a colour not on the hospital's approved list, learning that the most profound repair she could offer might begin not with knowing the exact surgical procedure, but with being willing to sit in the unknown with someone to pick up a marker, literal or metaphorical, and draw a new face on an old, familiar fear. The borrowed life ends not with a dramatic exit, but with a subtle reclamation of authorship. You realise you are not a tenant following a landlord's rules. You are the architect, and the most radical act is not to dynamite the building, but to finally admit you've been living in the wrong rooms following a floor plan drafted for someone else. It is the courage to walk across the hall, to open a door you didn't know you had the key for, to step into a space that for the first time doesn't echo with the expectations of others, but with the sound of your own breath, your own pulse, your own untranslated, perfectly imperfect desire. It is the moment you stop performing a masterpiece written by another hand and finally allow yourself to sketch your own rough, beautiful, incomplete draft. The draft where a surgeon's hands might also be an artist's, where healing is not just a science but a kind of poetry. There is a specific kind of silence that falls in the minutes after you realize you've been living someone else's life. It's not the silence of shock. It's quieter than that, deeper. It's the silence of a system, your own nervous system powering down a program it has been running for decades, a program labelled How to Be Valuable. For her, the inheritance was never the medical degree hanging on the wall. That was just the certificate. The real inheritance passed down through generations of solemn, dutiful people was the operating system itself. The unshakable belief that your worth is a function of your utility. That to be loved is to be times needed, asterisk. To be needed is to be times useful, asterisk. And to be useful is to solve, to fix, to carry. Her hands had learned this language before her mind could question it. They were fluent in the grammar of service, the precise pressure of a stethoscope, the sure tie of a suture, the calm steadiness holding a chart. They spoke in pulses and breath sounds in the silent somatic dialect of care that bypassed words and went straight to the body's truth. But here is what the operating system never accounted for: the grumpy balloon animal. The absurd crooked dog fashioned from a leftover procedural glove. The way it hovered in the air between her and the man in 304, a man whose pain was a fortress no medication could fully breach. It was a useless thing, a frivolous thing. It solved nothing, fixed nothing, carried no weight. And yet, when his eyes, tired, resigned, etched with pain, landed on that lopsided creation, something broke. Not in him. In the Times script asterisk, a crack appeared in the solemn, sterile narrative of the room. And through that crack came a sound the operating system had no file for: a startled, rusty, utterly genuine laugh. It was a communication that bypassed every medical protocol and went straight to the human, a fragment of a different native tongue, one she didn't know she still knew. That laugh was the first quiet signal of a rebellion. Not a rebellion against care, but for it. A rebellion to expand the definition of healing beyond the clinical, to include the creative, to understand that sometimes the most profound medicine isn't about having the right answer, but about being willing to sit in the unknown with someone and draw a new face on an old, familiar fear. The system, her own internal one, flagged it as an error. Asterisk, invalid input. Non-productive action. Return to core functions. Asterisk. But the feeling was a new kind of data. It was light. It was connection that didn't drain but replenished. It was care that wasn't heavy but buoyant. For the first time, she wasn't just managing a symptom, she was meeting a person. And in that meeting, she met a part of herself. The blueprint had no room for the artist, the maker of silly, beautiful, useless things. Healing, she began to see, wouldn't mean abandoning the structure she'd built. That structure was solid. It was real. It had held her. The rebellion was to finally move into it as herself, to bring her own furniture, to paint the walls a colour not on the hospital's or her family's approved list. It was the courage to walk from the room labelled "Only Serious Solutions" to the one next door, a room she'd always sensed but never entered. The door was unmarked. It simply said, "What if?" She turned the handle. The air inside was different, lighter. It didn't smell of antiseptic and quiet anxiety. It smelled of possibility and faintly of rubber balloons. In this room, her surgeon's hands were not less. They were more. They were also an artist's hands, a translator's hands. They could tie a suture with the same reverence they used to twist a balloon, because both were acts of creation. Both were acts of care. The borrowed life ends not with a dramatic exit, but with a subtle seismic shift of ownership. You realize you are not a tenant in your own existence, following a landlord's rules, written in a will you never agreed to. You are the architect. You have always been the architect. And the most radical act is not to dynamite the building. It's to finally admit you've been living in the wrong wing, following a floor plan drafted for a ghost. It is the quiet decision to walk across the hall, to open a door you always had the key to, and to step into a space that, for the very first time, doesn't echo with the expectations of others. It echoes with your own breath, your own pulse, your own untranslated, perfectly imperfect desire. It is the moment you stop performing a masterpiece, written by another hand, and finally allow your fingers to sketch your own rough, beautiful, incomplete draft. The draft where healing is not just a science, but a kind of poetry. Part 5. The blueprint had no room for the artist. The world had given her a script, a clean, logical, bullet-pointed document titled "Times How to Be a Person**. It was written in the language of milestones, of checked boxes, of respectable, tangible things. It had chapters on building a career, on forming sensible relationships, on achieving a state of stable, unremarkable fineness. It was a masterpiece of defensive architecture, designed to withstand storms and scrutiny. But the blueprint had no room for the artist, the maker of silly, beautiful, useless things. Healing, she began to see, wouldn't mean abandoning the structure she'd built. That structure was solid. It was real. It had held her. The rebellion was to finally move into it as herself, to bring her own furniture, To paint the walls a colour not on the world's or her own inner critic's approved list. It was the courage to walk from the room labelled ***, only practical things, ***, to the one next door, a room she'd always sensed but never entered. The door was unmarked. It simply said ***, what if you just made it? ***. She turned the handle. The air inside was different. It didn't smell of productivity and mild dread. It smelled of curiosity and faintly of wet clay and cheap acrylic paint. In this room, her analyst's mind was not less. It was more. It was also a poet's mind, a gardener's mind. It could deconstruct a problem with the same focus it used to arrange words on a page, because both were acts of meaning-making. Both were acts of love. The performance ends, not with a curtain call, but with a quiet internal click of the microphone being turned off. You realise you are not an actor on a stage built by other people's applause, reciting lines from a script you didn't write. You are the playwright. You have always been the playwright. And the most revolutionary act is not to burn the theatre down. It's to finally see you've been performing in the wrong play, wearing a costume tailored for a stranger. It is the silent decision to walk backstage, to open the door to your own cluttered, chaotic workshop, and to step into a space that, for the very first time, isn't silent with the judgment of an audience. It hums with your own focus, your own experimentation, your own uncurated, gloriously messy process. It is the moment you stop gaslighting yourself into believing the borrowed life was ever yours, and finally pick up the tools to build something that is not a monument, but a home where the heart is not just a pump, but a kind of compass.